Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a webcast brought to you each week by the Daily Journal and djournal.com, back in our normal Monday 2 o'clock slot now. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brad Locke, joined as always by Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison down there in Jackson at the state capitol. Bobby, how you doing?
All right, Brad, how you doing?
Can't complain, Bobby.
Yeah.
Can't complain. At least
I'm glad if you did.
I'm glad we're back on Monday now. I know we had to go to Tuesday for a couple of weeks for various reasons.
Yeah.
And this time I remembered to start the show with the camera on me instead of on you. So I'm already ahead of the game. Right there, Bobby. Unlike last week.
Well,
you have a good weekend, Bobby?
I did. I stayed up all Saturday night to watch the Australian Open finals, but enjoyed doing that. But I kind of caught up on sleep last night, so I'm good to go.
Sounds like something Kyle Veazey would do. I don't know if you know Kyle. Used to work for the Clarion Ledger. We were on the Mississippi State beat together. He sets his alarm for like 2:30 or whenever just to watch the Australian Open. So you're one of those tennis fans, I guess.
Yeah, but that had set my alarm. My wife would have been mad, so I just stayed up.
All right. Well, enough tennis talk. Let's talk politics and education funding. How about that? Let's start with EdBuild. That's been a hot topic, of course, all session, really since October when they hired that New Jersey-based consulting company to rewrite the education funding formula for Mississippi. And the AP had an in-depth look at what this might mean. Did the numbers, did the math. Apparently they're better at math than Rebecca Sibilia. Referencing a quote she had last week, the CEO of EdBuild said she's not good at math. I'm not either. I'm not judging. But basically, according to this, and you wrote about it, Bobby, on Sunday, if EdBuild is in place and fully funded, it would provide $96 million less to the local districts than a fully funded Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which is the current vehicle for education funding in the state, Bobby. Now, is that oversimplifying it a bit, or because Philip Gunn and Tate Reeves say, well, there's no bill, so it's kind of a speculation at this point. What do we make of these numbers?
Yeah, well, I mean, the important thing to remember is here it is. Tomorrow is the deadline to pass this bill out of committee, and there's no bill yet. That's unusual in itself. So what AP did, Jeff Amey, a very enterprising reporter for the Associated Press, he described the EdBuild recommendation as a cookbook, and he took their recommendations and did some internet research and came up with numbers. Now it would provide about 75 million if EdBuild was passed as it's recommended. I mean, if the EdBuild proposals were passed by the legislature and the legislature fully funded EdBuild, it would provide $75 million more than current funding. But what you have to remember is MAEP, the current formula, is $172 million short of full funding. So if you compare the full funding of MAEP versus the full funding of the EdBuild recommendations, not what the legislature's passed, because the legislature says it's not going to pass the EdBuild recommendations as they are, but we don't know what the legislature is going to pass. If you compare those apples to apples, it's $96 million short EdBuild is of what MAEP would provide. And it's important to note, Brad, that apparently under the EdBuild proposal, there's a lot more winners and losers than with MAEP. When MAEP was passed in 97, there was a conscious effort to make sure that no school district would receive less money than they were receiving at that point in time. But under the EdBuild proposal, if it was fully funded, there would be school districts that would receive significantly less money than they're receiving now, and some districts that receive more money than they're receiving now. So that's another key difference between the MAEP proposal and EdBuild.
Do we know? It said about half and half. Half would receive more money, half less. Would we have any idea at this point which ones? I know they're trying to direct more money to the poorer school districts, so I would assume they would get a little more, right?
And well, in most instances, but there's some quirks in the law, like some of the small, what you consider small rural counties that you would think of as poor counties, like Choctaw. But they have two in that small county. They have two power plants, so they actually have a large tax base. So they could receive significantly less money. Tupelo would probably receive less money, and some other school districts in the area that might receive less money include Aberdeen and maybe Baldwin and Oxford.
A lot of people obviously have a problem with EdBuild, including Hob Bryan, one of the architects of MAEP back 20 years ago now. His big problem, I guess, more than anything, Bobby, is just the what he's calling the secrecy of it. And certainly this has all kind of been happening quickly. And like you said, there's not going to be a bill ready by tomorrow. We'll get into that in a moment. But I guess is that the main hang up, or is specifically EdBuild the proposals themselves what people also have a problem with?
Well, people have problems with both. I mean, I think that most people would concede that, after 20 years, there needs to be some changes to the MAEP funding formula. There needs to be more of an emphasis on special needs for special education. They probably need to revisit the issue of whether you count all the students who are in a school on a particular day or all the students who are just the enrollment and not taking into account absences. There's all sorts of issues to address with MAP, but the fact that here it is so late in the process and we don't know what the speaker and lieutenant governor both go out of the way to say the EdBuild proposal will not be our final proposal. Well, that's fine, but here it is. Good ways to the legislative session. And we don't even have a proposal from the lieutenant governor's office or from the speaker's office. And another key thing, Brad, that has a lot of people concerned is under the EdBuild proposal. And I think this is something that I think the legislative leadership would probably agree with. There's no mechanism for inflation. Under MAP. Every 4 years, they recalculate the numbers based on inflation, the inflation rate, but there's no mechanism in the EdBuild proposal to do that. In other words, the legislature is just going to pick a number, and that's going to be the number. And so, in that sense, the legislature, a lot of education supporters would contend the legislature is never going to be held accountable for funding the EdBuild proposal or whatever proposal they come up with. And another issue is that, in the midst of all this, Brad, no matter, for the sake of argument, concede that EdBuild would produce more money for local schools than MAEP does. What makes you think they're going to fund that? I mean, there's no evidence that they are. MAEP's been underfunded $1.8 billion since 2008, been fully funded twice, and is underfunded $172 million for the current year. So that, in a sense, we're just kind of arguing about what a formula is not going, what it looks like, and not actually arguing about funding education.
Something you mentioned earlier, tomorrow is a key deadline for bills to pass out of committee. 8 p.m. tomorrow night is the deadline. Not really going to be a bill per se dealing with these EdBuild proposals. Doesn't mean there won't be legislation coming, because you can pass what they call a dummy bill. Bobby, kind of explain how the process might go forward from here.
Well, some people don't like to use that term, dummy bill, because I guess some people think it might hit too close to home. But it's essentially what it is a bill that would have all the legal code sections alive, just would pass those code sections. So later in the process, the legislature would be free to amend that bill any way they saw fit to incorporate any proposal that they might deem appropriate at that time if the code sections were alive. Now, Brad, you were partially right. Now, the Senate Education Chair Gray Tollison has said that he does plan to have a bill introduced tomorrow to pass out of his committee. There's not going to be a House bill, but it appears, unless Senator Tollison changes his mind, there will be a Senate bill introduced tomorrow.
Gray Tollison, a Republican from Oxford, the Senate Education Chair. I mean, how that's a pretty quick turnaround, Bob, because I know some people having trouble just wrapping their heads around the proposals and what they mean. So it'd be kind of interesting to see what Gray Tollison's bill is about, what it says. Because that's, again, they haven't had much time to really kind of assess this and examine it and analyze it. and just I don't know. What are you expecting there?
I expect that, I do expect that there'll be some form of EdBuild proposals, despite what the Lieutenant Governor and Speaker say. I do suspect that there'll be some aspects of the EdBuild proposals incorporated into the Tolleson bill, and we'll just, but what aspects? It's just kind of a guess at this point in time. I don't think there'll be a growth factor, but I do think there'll be some changes from EdBuild so that there will not be as much of a burden on local school districts as far as increasing local property taxes as perhaps the EdBuild proposal would result in. But it's kind of a guess right now, though.
Yeah, certainly. All right. Well, plenty more coming with the EdBuild and all of that in the coming days. We'll keep you apprised of what happens there. Let's switch gears a little bit to Bobby. Let's talk about internet tax. The news came down last week that Amazon, the online retail giant, will enforce will collect the 7% tax on online purchases. It's called a use tax. It's not technically a sales tax, I guess, Bobby. It's kind of the same thing.
Same thing.
Kind of, sort of. But anyway, this means extra revenue, obviously, for the state of Mississippi. A little debate on how much it might mean. But what I want to talk about here is how it might get used. And a lot of people think, well, we've had trouble getting more funds for infrastructure, road and bridge repair, something desperately needed. So it looks like that's got a lot of support, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of support for. There's the Department of Revenue, through its work on its own, convinced Amazon to collect the tax. There's a Supreme Court, just a little background, Brad. There's a Supreme Court ruling from 1992 saying that a state cannot collect what they call remote taxes,
right,
if the business does not have a physical brick and mortar building in the state. So, of course, all these internet companies, Amazon doesn't have a brick and mortar building in Mississippi, and a lot of these companies don't. And it also impacts, purchases made through catalogs, to what J. Crew, I guess, or I don't
Sears
know.
Roebuck catalog, Bobby.
But Sears has Sears has a building in the state, so that they have to collect the tax. Maybe J. Crew does. I don't know. I don't know shopping. But anyway, at any rate,
I was going to say that the thing about that ruling, it was 1992. I don't think Amazon was even around back then. It didn't. No. Internet shopping was not a thing. Yeah, so you would think that maybe that would warrant it being revisited because it seems a little bit antiquated.
Right, and there's in sort of at the same time Department of Revenue is doing this, there's legislation being considered this session that would require these companies to collect this tax and remit it to the state, just like Reed's department store in Tupelo or any other department store in Tupelo has to collect the tax when you and I going to buy a shirt or a tie or coat or a pair of pants. They collect that 7% sales tax, send it to the state. And but these internet companies don't have to do that. But there's legislation to require them to, despite the Supreme Court ruling. And there's several states doing stuff like that right now, trying to get the Supreme Court to revisit this issue. And what you alluded to was in the Mississippi legislation, it was amended last week to require the proceeds from collecting this tax to go to road and bridge improvements.
Right. Yeah. I know there was Jason White, he's on the Ways and Means Committee, I guess, amended legislation that would authorize the state to, divert that 70% to the state level, 30% to cities and counties. Now, I guess the question there, if that happens, is that fair? Should counties and cities get more?
Well, that's a policy issue right now on just a standard 7% sales tax that Walmart or Reed's or whomever have to collect. 18.5%, I believe it is, goes back to the municipalities, and the state keeps the rest. Mm-hmm. Now the counties, out of that tax, the counties don't get anything. Right. So some people are arguing in the Ways and Means Committee last week that the county shouldn't get any of this money because they do get a state appropriation each year for called for state aid road program, which is local county roads that the state does pay for some of the upkeep on, and then they also have a bridge program to help the counties repair substandard bridges. So some people contend that the counties are already getting money. The municipalities are not for road and bridges, so the county shouldn't get any of this money. But that's a good ways down the road. Sure. I don't know if the Ways and Means Committee approved this legislation. I don't know how far to go in the House and the Senate, but that is one way to kind of deal with what many people see as major road and bridge problems in the state.
All right, good stuff as always, Bobby, and that's it for today's episode of Capitol View. Again, a webcast coming to you every Monday about 2 p.m. here at djournal.com with myself and Bobby Harrison. You can find Bobby's work in the Journal and at djournal.com. Bobby's on Twitter at BobbyHarrison9. And Bobby, good work as always. And again, a big deadline tomorrow night for bills. So look for his coverage from Jackson on all of that. Bobby?
Appreciate it, Brad.
Thank you, sir. Everybody else, have a good day. We'll see you next week.